I am very pleased to present our two discussants for this Tying Together the Threads session. They are Ray Walshe, seated next to me, Professor of ICT Standardization at Dublin City University, and the asker of many questions that we've heard in the course of the day. And also very, very nice to welcome Roland Portmann. He's head of the section for international law at the Directorate for International Law of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland. So let me ask you, first of all, that most basic of all questions, your main takeaways from these three use case sessions, from yesterday as well, of course, but what are the main things that stood out for you, Ray?
Yeah, thanks, Melinda. I mean, fantastic array of speakers and really interesting. So what Roland and myself are going to try and do is try and synopsize this as best we can. And starting from yesterday, we had Jessup and Sergio and Philippe and Roger, and they were talking about the grand challenges, the fact that we require openness and transparency, because this is all part of the trust agenda. So we need to incorporate that into all of our approaches to standardization, to certification, to legislation, to regulation. We have the risks of AI being discussed. This happened in the plenary opening session yesterday, and we were talking about ethics. And there is no one ethic. Unfortunately, there isn't a global ethic. It doesn't exist. So we need to be cognizant of the fact that there are cultural and regional differences. And we have political discussions, we have technical discussions, standards discussions, regulatory discussions. And in the middle of all of that is the way forward, which was collaboration. And it came through over and over again throughout the talks that not just the need for collaboration, but actually the will for collaboration, which was there, which was fantastic. We saw that technology is evolving faster than standards, and standards evolve faster than regulations. So it's easier to, from a legislator point of view, to base your regulations on standards, and then as standards can be changed on a regular basis, and the regulations are updated because they have that basis, that foundational work. And I thought one interesting quote that came from yesterday, I'm not sure what it may have been Roger that said this, but I didn't note it down at the time, but even if you don't understand the complex AI system and how it achieves this decision, you can regulate its output. So while we're talking about looking underneath the hood, and learning more about how the process involved for convolutional neural networks or deep learning, etc., it's very difficult to figure out what's happening. You can still regulate outputs even if you don't understand the process. So that brings us on to the first session, and then I'm going to hand over to Roland to talk about the first session. At the start, we had Kirsten and Andreas, and they were talking about data quality and the reliability of data sets. Been very, very important in trying to create a regulatory or standardization environment. And ethics has to be the central part of this discussion. You need, for trust, you need an ethical basis. And what we need to do is try and break down what is ethics and what is trust. What are the key contributing factors to ethics and to trust, so that we can better understand it for ourselves, because there is no one global ethic. And Andrea said that WHO, for example, it's part of its remit or its mandate is to address inequalities, on a global stage. And that equity and that equality is part of the ethics discussion, removal of bias. Kai brought this up this morning in session one, and Kai said about we need to open up AI, we need to lift the bonnet off AI, we need to shine a light and see how far the light actually goes. So people want to have that openness, that transparency, to understand and to be comfortable in an AI system setting, and agree on ethical principles. We expect AI to do better. We expect AI to be better than the physician, for example, and actually, the best way for both the technology and the regulation, the standards, to progress is a co-evolution. So to evolve technologies with standardization and with technical and ethical discussions. So that would lead to a sort of a collaboration consensus, and then the end of that, as you know, Melinda, because it seems to be the focal point that we keep coming back to, is who should do what next, that next step. So that was the first opening use case. So I'll hand over to Roland to provide some input on that.
Thank you.
Well,
Roland, please.
Thank you very much. Well, I think about the first use case, what struck me first was also this view, and I think Kerstin was the one who outlined it, that, well, we have to see, this is not the first time we're dealing with new technological developments, that law and standards have already dealt with this in the past. And so that we could also learn from past experiences how to approach these issues. And I think that has at least with me, it rang a bell somehow also. What does it mean now that the different actors have to collaborate? And it was always this question of, well, who is doing what? And I think as a first basis for proceeding with that, it seems to me it's very important to know, well, what is already there. And at least from my point of view, and as you said, Melinda, so I'm coming from the area of international law. So what I learned in these past 1.5 days is there are many standards, and there are many conformity assessment procedures concerning AI that exist already, and that I have to admit I didn't know before very well. And I think maybe for some of you from the conformity assessment or standard side, it may well be that what, for example, Thomas Schneider told you about the Council of Europe negotiations and so on, it was maybe also news, or at least you weren't as much in detail into this before. And it seems to me that before kind of saying, well, of course, I'm all in favor of, well, we have to continue our exchanges and our collaborations, but maybe in order to be a bit more concrete, what do we have to do? I think we kind of have to map what is there in the different fields. So what is there on the legal side? And we also heard this morning, but that was already the second session, so I don't want to go too much into that, but we already heard, well, there can be existing laws that have nothing to do with AI that may play a role, for example, export control laws and so on. So we need to map, well, what is there in law, what is there in the standard side, what is there on the conformity assessment side. And then I think what is really important is that we start to connect them more. So in a sense, how do you reference standards in legal instruments, or why should you do it, and what consequences do you draw on the legal side of a certain application being in conformity with standards or having gone through a conformity assessment? So I think one task that I took also, especially from this first use case, a task that we probably have as a group that is now thinking on these issues, could really be, well, map what is there, make it in a sense, this mapping accessible to everyone, and then look really for the interconnections between the two. Because I think that's also something that, at least to me, it seems to be very difficult still to say, well, if on the legal side you create certain obligations or at least principles, I mean, what does someone from the standards community do with it? Is it possible to substantiate them, or is it just something where someone from the standards, I would say, well, I cannot do anything with these principles? So there needs to be, or these interconnections have to be drawn somehow. And I certainly was struck by that in the first use case also, this idea of, well, we're dealing with new developments in medicine, but we already have many of the tools from the past that we should apply to them, and then see, of course, well, where is there a need for new approaches?
Mm-hmm. And certainly when we map what's there, we map not only potential interconnections, but we also map lacuna. Where are the gaps that we definitely do need to address? Right, please continue.
Yeah, so that brought us then, but Roland and myself have been looking at obviously the second use case, and that started with Thomas and Vincent were talking about cameras and how you had, as Thomas mentioned, functional creep, where the cameras were originally being used like as a security CCTV camera footage, obviously, and then that went and evolved into, well, let's see if we can identify temperature based on the camera images, and then after that, then went on to look at face masks and from a regulatory point of view to see if people were complying with the use of face masks, and that starts up a whole new discussion then into what is intended use and what is unintended use, and the risks and concerns then associated with those technologies, because we're looking at a standardized technology in terms of the use of sensors, but then we have, when you bring AI into it and you add added value and added function to it, then that means that we have to go through this process of potentially recertification and reevaluating what the original use for, because you may have to come up with a new body of law just because there's a new use case based on what was a pre-existing technology. So standards can't just focus on technical and systemic issues, and they don't, because like we've lots of people here. I'm involved in SC42 myself as well, and we've been talking over the last 2 days about the different aspects of the various work programs that are ongoing there. So it's not just about technology issues. We're talking about risks, and we're talking about system management, and we're talking about trustworthiness. So it's not just a purely technical argument. And Kim mentioned then actually in use case 2 then about the need for impact assessments and trusting the developers of AI as well. So we have this we have this need for trust, and it's based in people at the end of the day, not in machines. And you need diversity. You need diversity in terms of the committees that are creating the standards, the developers that are creating the AI systems. All of that is interlinked. It's not two separate ecosystems. It's one ecosystem, and really it's an ecosystem of trust. Because we're talking about the ethics of people at the end of the day. It's not the ethics of machines. Machines don't have ethics. It's the people that have ethics, and it's that instantiation of that ethical principles that happens through the use of the mechanical and artificially intelligent systems. So that's a sort of an opening statement then to introduce Roland into the second use case, and what the takeaways there are. Really, again, it's in inclusivity, use of greater diversity in the way we go about doing our business as standardizers, as legislators, as regulators, and also in terms of this continuous compliance, the need for conformity assessment that doesn't just happen and you draw a line through it and say, we'll park that there, that's happened. As technology advances and as the use of sensors migrates to new use cases, we need to reevaluate that whole system again and see, is there new accreditation required, new certification, new metrics, new legislation, new regulation.
Yeah, maybe just adding to that, I think what I took from the second use case is also this, well, that you are dealing with products that with a slight add-on maybe, or just with a different kind of use, then pose new challenges, and you may ask yourself, well, is this still in compliance with the obligations that exist? And I think maybe now again a bit more from the legal perspective, but I think it holds true for standards and conformity assessment. I think that means if we're dealing with such products, it's much more difficult to define ex ante how they should function or work. And I think you kind of have to adapt what rules or standards or procedures you design, because you need more abstract principles, more abstract well, criteria according to which you then perform a conformity assessment or other procedures. So I think that if you're defining very concretely and specifically a certain product, if this product is used in a different context, the rule or the law or the standard is not useful anymore. So I think if we're dealing, what I took away from it, dealing with AI means you have to have broader principles, broader criteria in all fields, I think, law, standardization, and conformity assessment, in order to deal with the adaptability, but also with different uses of these products that may pose new challenges.
You know, you talked about mapping what's already there. Clearly, you're also talking about mapping the information we're getting on an ongoing basis as we see applications in intended and unintended uses, and that generating essentially in some way reporting functions on the part of different people along, or different actors along the value chain.
Absolutely, Melinda. I mean, I think there is that constant need for market surveillance anyway, like, you know, and we, I know some of the projects I'm involved in with, from the European Commission's point of view, StandICT is one of them. And we go through a process of doing a landscape analysis on standards that are currently available in AI, including the SA42 and GHC21 standards. But also we do that for IoT and for blockchain and for smart cities. And there's a whole suite of them coming out one after the other. But that doesn't just stop once you've done that that first landscape report or the gap analysis, you have to go back routinely every 6 months, every 12 months, and do an update of it. Like so, it's a continuous process, and that leads us nicely into the last session, the last use case session anyway, which is on the robots and the service robots in particular, and as a discussion point, I'm looking at standardization and the need for collaboration and more collaboration. And Adil, I think, kicked off the discussion there with human in the loop and the fact that even from a terms and definitions point of view, that people have different understandings of what human in the loop means. And I remember Adil saying that just because it was designed, the system was designed by a human in the first place, surely there is a human in the loop already. Whereas most people understand human in the loop as being there's a second guessing of the machine, or at least an oversight of the machine before any decision is made. So you have this human in the loop, you have the machine and the man on two separate sides. And Viveka then brought in the idea of well, that there's risk associated with having this environment where cobots are actually involved. And if there's risk, then there's going to be a legal aspect to that at some stage. There's going to be liability legislation against risk in case there's any damage or any loss of control, etc. And so this cobots and who's in control, Eckhart went on to discover, well, who's in control? Is it the human, or is it the service robot or the cobot? And if that has an impact then on society, like and there was talk about the risk of losing jobs, and this is a byproduct of having a more automated industrial situation. There's a level of exposure required as a result of cobots been included in that environment, and then that has a physical risk as well as maybe an economical risk as well. And Adil continued then to talk about safety, and Mark came in on safety and talk about robots, and he very interestingly referred to robots in terms of R2D2 and Siri, which was great because he started to personalize robots, and you start seeing like, well, how they can be integrated into society, and how we can sometimes get used to using robots without actually forgetting the fact that these are intelligent artifacts and intelligent AI systems. And that does be, but Mark also mentioned that there's also a threat associated with that situation, like, because what if you're forcing a robot into an environment where it's not suited to or not welcome, even in terms of its situationalness. And one of the key, I suppose, accelerators for potentially for maybe including more assistive technology or cobots or robots in society would be smart cities. Was an exemplar that Mark mentioned there, and the fact that we have an aging population, and when we will have to replace certain parts of our labor force, and that created another large discussion around whether or not that we have a good I suppose practical solutions for how we can target the jobs that are necessary for the robots or cobot environments, and how we go about doing that, and are we doing it in the right way? And that's a whole new discussion. So we have skills and upskilling needs required in terms of the use of these robotic entities, the need for continuous monitoring, as we mentioned before, the fact that we have this division of labor. Viveka mentioned this, the division of labor, and it's not split equally because of the aging society. So there's always going to be a side in which it's more economical or more societal friendly potentially to engage robots in one particular sector and not in another. We had this large discussion from Melinda, you actually kicked this off, I think, on codes of conduct versus standards, and that brought in this sort of spectrum of views about whether we should just have a bottom-up approach or a top-down approach to standardization and as a foundational method. And then Mark talked about the risk of disenchantment, which that was a very interesting statement about, and this the devaluing of human contact by virtue of the fact that your robots replacing some of the human contact related mechanisms. So that led us to the discussion on liability and responsibility with robots, and the obligation on developers, because they're the ones that are doing the designing of the robots, and the use of stakeholders in the AI value chain. That it always comes back down to this collaboration, engagement, diversity of our stakeholder a group that we're talking to. And again and again, and I have it in my notes over and over again, it's about collaboration, that the need to work together. And this can only happen at the highest level. Like, Mark was talking about AI communities and social connections, and all of this has to be done at the very highest level. And I'll hand over to Roland now, but before we do a sort of a synopsis at the end for the grand challenge or the way forward, maybe.
Well, thanks. Yeah. Well, I think for me, what I took away from it is, in a sense, maybe a sense of optimism at the end of these use cases, because I have to say, I thought the discussion today and also yesterday showed me also, well, we're dealing with a very complicated issue here, and I think it is difficult to say, well, we now arrived at this conclusion after these 1.5 days, but we're more starting a conversation, and I think a very important exchange among us. But what this third use case also showed me, and I think it was mentioned by several of the panelists, I mean, we're dealing with really complicated social, policy, ethical issues here when we're talking about robotics and work and other issues. And I think, in a sense, that shows as well, it's probably not as surprising that we cannot just come up with a solution now. Just say, well, in effect, if you just think it through, it's very easy how to deal with AI, because it's not just a limited set of consequences of a technology, but there are societal, ethical, economic consequences of all that we're talking about. And well, you can say, well, that shows you even more how daunting the task is, but in a sense, it's also, I mean, that's what we're dealing with all the time in our societies and in international relations. So I think that shows you, well, we're in a framework that, in a sense, we already know, but we have to adapt it to these new challenges.
And, I have to say something that occurred to me again and again when I was listening to the discussions about these overarching societal and political themes, and they came up in every use case. And yes, there's a body of law out there that addresses a lot of these issues, but AI throws this into a new context and sheds a new light on many of these that have remained challenges for decades, whether it's in the labor law area, whether it's in the health area, whether it's in the area of privacy rights in the face of surveillance. So I've been trying to think about the pairing that we have here, the IEC and the Swiss federal department as where is the comparative niche there for continuing the collaboration, or, for essentially establishing a platform? And it seems to me the standards piece is pretty clear. That is quite evident in all the discussions we've had. But another comparative advantage of this particular city, it must be said, is the presence of many global actors who are relatively trusted, who have broad international participation, and who have been wrestling with a lot of these issues, whether it's the ILO or others, for a long, long time. And it seems to me that trying to get a grip on those more, they're harder topics to sort of to address. They don't have nice numbers like standards, but they're obviously crucial going forward. So that's something that occurred to me as the two of you were speaking. I don't know if you see it that way as well, Roland.
Yeah, I think in very similar terms. And I think, as you mentioned, if you're talking, first of all, you're talking about, but I'm sure lots of people here will not agree with me when I say, well, AI is a technology, because I guess that's not really accurate to say, but at least it's a technological development. And I think that was really what you just said. That also became very clear to me also during these 1.5 days. At the end of the day, you're talking about consequences of this development in all spheres of international life, but also of national policy areas and so on. And I think Geneva is really very well positioned, and we saw that also during these 1.5 days, that lots of these organizations were present and were dealing from their perspective with what AI means in their field. And I would add another dimension, but that's very much from where I come from, and that is the whole field of international law and international governance,
Yeah.
where at the end of the day it comes down to that, what basic principles we can maybe agree on. And there was also a discussion in, I think, almost most of the use cases about, well, it's probably not as realistic to think about global principles. And of course, there are differences on a regional level, on cultural level, and so on. But at the end of the day, at least some principles on a regional level or on some level could be agreed on. And there are various instruments in international law to deal with that. I mean, you can talk about a legally binding instrument, but you can also talk about other instruments that at least give you some guidance how to approach these things. And I think Geneva is traditionally a place for international law. I think we also, as the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we are traditionally very engaged in these processes. And I think that is an overarching topic that then comes into play in all different areas.
I also had the sense in our discussions that an international standard sometimes can set a floor or create a join up between different cultures that perhaps wouldn't agree on some important governance issues, but certainly can perhaps not only agree on, but welcome that basic structure as something that that can establish a common ground.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Roland said, like what we're dealing with here now is it's a global grand challenge. I mean, the whole purpose of the conference is AI with trust. If it was a trivial exercise, we would have done it a long time ago. Somebody would already have done it. It's not easy, and it needs global solutions. And with global solutions, you need global actors. And as Roland said, like one of the issues, one of the reasons, I suppose, that Geneva is well set for is the volume of international actors that are here, which are nation-based. It's not just individual organizations or consortia. It's nation states that are represented on global organizations. And I think there's an opportunity here to build on the discussion. Somebody has to take the next step. And there's always a sort of fear factor of who's that going to be, and a bit of reticence because I don't want to be the first person to act in case it upsets somebody else. But in terms of developing systems, and international standards is a good way of looking at it, is that someone has to draft the first document. And that's 4 or 5 people that come together and sit down, and it's not 400, it's not 500, it's not 4 million or 5 million. Somebody has to make a step forward, and it's about inclusivity. It's about having your diversity of stakeholder involvement to do it right, do it at a global level and at a global scale. And when you're talking about stakeholder investment, like we were talking about with the ILO and WHO and UNESCO and IEC and ISO and ITU, then these are the sort of actors that can bring that the pull of the society behind them to do something right. And I think that's a first step, but it's up to these people to make it happen. We've been talking about doing initiatives like this for at least 10 years that I'm talking about it. And now I think is the time to take the next step forward and to make it happen and to bring that society together, that we have the consensus of collaboration already. So now we just need to have the consensus of action.
Mm-hmm. We're going to go straight into a discussion of next steps, but let me give Roland a chance to say the last word in this session, and then we'll move seamlessly on to the next.
Well, there's not much I can add to that, but I mean, just to underline that, and I think that was very clear to me also, and it was mentioned many times, we need to collaborate more, and I think we all agree with that, and now we need to define, well, what concretely do we do? My boss, Roger, posed the challenge to us this morning. Well, what does it mean concretely? And I think that's the next step, but I'm sure we will get some ideas.
Exactly, that's where we want to go. It's all on Ian now. So let me say thank you very much to Ray and Roland.